I always try to find new ways to use existing tools, and I love automating every tiny task. Recently, I've been trying to find a better player trigger, a method to trigger something based on what the player is doing. Like a workstation that turns on by just looking at it, or a door that knows you're coming. You have probably seen the transmitter, a device that can track you, and amongst a lot of data you can read out the player position. These are my coordinates, and you can see them change as I move around. Now all we need is a known position in the world and a little bit of trigonometry, and we can calculate the distance between me and any point in the world. Adding a proximity trigger to this is pretty straightforward. And the transmitter spits out more interesting values. These are labeled velocity relative, but despite their name, they have nothing to do with your velocity. Depending on your mathematical experience, you might recognize what these are. It's the sine and cosine values of your rotation. From that, it's easy to calculate the player rotation. This is the same rotation value you can see in the HUD, except it's a lot more detailed. Now that we have rotation values as well as position, we can calculate the relative angle between my rotation and a point. Imagine a line between the light and my feet, and another line going out in the direction I'm looking. This is the angle between these two lines. And once we have that info, we can add a trigger value and toggle something by simply looking at it. To illustrate this better, imagine we had a cone in front of us, turning everything inside that cone on and everything else off. Because this works relative to our position, it works just as well no matter where we stand. Next up, we can calculate your change in position, and that will give us velocity, our last data point. As you can see, my running speed is about 2 meters per game tick, and together with rotation and position, we can build a velocity vector. Down this hallway you can see a row of lights, but they are not turning on. That's because I'm not moving. When I start to move, the lights turn on in front of me. If I stop, they turn off. And if I walk back, it will turn on behind me. And because it scales with velocity, if I move faster, they will turn on further away. Essentially, it predicts my path and checks if that path intersects with any points. You might be wondering how this can be useful. My first thought came to an automatic garage door, or just automatic doors in general. But because it's just a trigger, you can combine it with your own logic and make your own custom airlock greet you. You can use it to trigger just about anything. Maybe automatically turning on a beacon when you're out and about, or having chutes deliver things to you. However, my favorite application is probably the fridge that opens when you look at it and automatically closes as you look away. But your own imagination is the real limit, and if anyone have any great ideas, please share them in the comments. Real quick on how to set it up for those that's interested. You need a transmitter, one IC and something to trigger. The code looks like this, but I'm not going to go through everything. The first thing you'll need is coordinates to a trigger point. Then we have the 3 trigger zones. The first one is a simple proximity trigger, and is determined by the distance limit. This one is set to toggle on 3 meters. Next, the rotation trigger has 2 settings. The angle limit determines how direct you have to look at the point to trigger, and angle check distance is the upper distance limit to avoid triggering things far away. The last zone is the velocity vector. Vector size is the number of ticks ahead of you it should look with your current velocity. This scales with your velocity, but depending on what you are triggering, you might want it to react faster or slower. The vector offset limit is how far off your path can be to trigger, because you don't want to trigger things by just walking next to it. In most cases, you probably want to have several of these zones active together. On a door, it's logical to have it trigger on your velocity vector, but adding a small proximity to it keeps the door open when you're standing next to it. Because these zones are only calculated in 2D, the Y limit is an absolute relative height restriction applied to all 3 zones, to avoid triggering things above or below you. You can change any of these values dynamically by changing it from a defined value to use either of the 2 free variables. Like with my fridge that uses a rotational trigger. I want the trigger to be narrow when it's closed, but wider when it's open. All of the calculated values are available for readout if you want to display them or use them for anything else. Or write your own clever logic like a door that only opens from one side. It's possible to get one IC to check multiple points or multiple players, but because of line execution limit, it can only check one player relative to 1 point per tick. So, to have a responsive system, I would recommend using one IC per point and player. However, there are no limit to how many devices you can trigger as long as they share a single trigger point. That's it. Thanks for watching.